and aggregate the global presence of now 110 countries since 1990. So let me start maybe clarifying what's global presence, what we are talking about, no? Because it's a concept that you may be used to, no? We talk about global presence a lot, but we must clarify what we are talking. So we say that global presence may be addressed by the following question. No? To what extent and in what form countries are out there, beyond their borders, but regardless if they are exerting real influence or power. So we can say that global presence may be the basis in which countries can exert that power if they are able to or willing to do it. No? But so it's a different concept, global presence or power. No? But we'll see that it's linked. So why we start this project now in 2010? No?
First publication in 2011, yes.
2011. This starts with the aim of contribute to the academic world or think tanks universe about the debate about globalization. What is globalization? Is globalization changing? What is the volume and the nature of globalization? And in other side, what are the profiles of external projections of each country? Because we'll see that here we include different indicators, different dimensions, economic, military, and soft, and countries may be out there, no, in the world because of different reasons. It may be because economic reasons, military reasons, or soft reasons. So in other sense, this index is also a tool of foreign policy to see, no, if what countries are doing there, and if the way these countries are projecting is the way they really want to. No? So, let's see there. Okay, so here is the inside of the index. No? We define this global presence by three dimensions: the economic one, military, and the soft one. In the economic one, we include exports of energy, primary goods, manufactured service, or foreign investment stocks. In the military one, it is important to clarify, we have been talking previously about this. In the military one, in the military dimension, sorry, we include the troops deployed outside, not the number of troops each country has, and also the military equipment, but that equipment necessary for that deployment. So we are not including nuclear weapons, we are not including the number of tanks or the kind of armament they have. We are including those equipment necessary for troop deployment, which is mostly naval equipment, aircraft carriers, amphibious ships, and other stuff. That's why we were talking with the Mexican delegation that countries with access to the sea, that has navy, are higher in military equipment than other ones that do not. No? And the third dimension, that soft one, is within one of the values of this index, because I'm sure that you have listened about the soft power, no? But there is like a lack of in defining what is this soft dimension. So here we propose a way to quantify that soft dimension in the basis of different indicators, such as development cooperation, education, science, technology, information, culture, sports, tourism, or migration. All these indicators are aggregated and put together by the coefficient you see there, which are results of different surveys that we conduct each 4 years to international experts in international relations from different countries, mostly all regions in the world. But well, we could go further in these methodological issues if you are interested on it. No?
I want the formulas.
You want the formula? Okay, so I say now we include 110 countries covering more than 99% of the world in terms of GDP, and 93% in terms of population. So we have a big universe here in terms of global presence that allows us to think about this globalization, in its whole concept. And we also calculate this index since 1990 from today. So we have a large historical series to analyze this change in global trends. Okay, so the first issue, the first virtue of an index is to order. That's one of the main objectives. And here you can see the ranking in global presence. In the first year we calculated the United States first position, Russia, by then the Soviet Union in the second one, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, at that time West Germany, Japan, Italy, Canada. So a ranking that it looks like familiar, no, in some sense. But you'll see the change in the following decades with the apparition of Spain there, the jump of Germany after reunification, and also the drop, the fall of Russia in this first decade after the end of the Soviet Union. China remains still latent, in that 10th position, but you'll see how it starts growing, and especially in the recent years because of its high growth, but also because of the impact of crisis in old powers. So China jumps to second position, and we could say that we know, this is not surprising, is the country that has benefited more of globalization in terms of this global presence. But I say that the first virtue of an index is to order, but the second one, and not less important, is to quantify. Because we know that China is growing, that's evident, no? But we maybe have doubts of how much rest to get the United States. So with this exercise, we can quantify that gap between China and the United States. I'm talking about this, but we will talk about each of the 100 countries. No? I'm talking about China and the United States because it's the most actual thing. No? But you see here, for example, the United States, 2,494 points, China, 800. So we'll say that today, the global presence of the United States is 3 times more than China. This is normal, but we think that we provide this kind of information to know exactly where we are. Also, in this map, you can see that we cover most part of the world, and also most part of the regions. We have North America and Europe full cover, most part of Asia also, and South America, and 2 regions, Central America and Africa, that is being growing or increasingly represented. No? In this sense, we have made an effort to increase the number of African countries included in the index. Now we include Algeria, Angola, Botswana, Cameroon, Democratic Republic of Congo, Cote d'Ivoire, Egypt, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Libya, Morocco, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, Sudan, Tanzania, Tunisia, Uganda, Zambia, and Zimbabwe.
In alphabetical order.
In alphabetical order. So we think we have a good group of African countries, very representative in terms of regional GDP, 87%, and in terms of population, 75%. So, well, we go further after in African issues, but this is one of the reasons of collaborating with SAIA, because we can quantify, we can order, but we don't know everything about all countries in the world. So we need this analyst expertise to analyze what is happening really. So this is in terms of global presence, but I said that this global index has 3 dimensions. And this exercise of ordering and quantifying can be done inside each dimension. So we have one global ranking, but also 3 different rankings of each dimension. Here you have the economic presence ranking, where again, United States first place. You see also here, China is second place, and Germany in third place. This will be maybe surprising that Germany is higher than, for example, United Kingdom, who was in third place in terms of global presence. Germany is higher in terms of economic presence. We call this in some publication the Germany effect. No? So China and Germany have been the main benefits in terms of economic presence. So now you can suppose that if United Kingdom is 4th in economic presence but 3rd in global presence, is due to the other dimensions, military or soft. I advance you that is because the soft one, the English, the cultural exports, migration, education, etc. In this ranking, economic ranking, we have mainly, say, all powers, but also some emerging countries. You look at Asian countries, China of course, South Korea, also India, Singapore, and some oil exporters, so United Arab Emirates in the last position. But if we look to the different trends, we could say that in all dimensions mostly, but in global present terms, all powers are decaying and emerging powers are growing. But they are still there. So we say decadent, not decay, emergent, not emerge. No? So for now. For now, that's it. So this is the economic one. And here you have the military presence ranking. The first thing, United States, of course, first position, and also a huge gap from rest to the second position, in this case, Russia. So Russia, that you we look at, was in the lower positions in the global presence ranking, is the second one in terms of military presence. Here also, well, we'll see later that this military presence has lost importance in terms of foreign relations, but there are some countries that are growing these military projections. China, we know, of course, but you may be surprised here with the provision of some emerging countries, and in particular for some African countries. This is the case of Ethiopia in the next position. I say that this position could be for different reasons. In this case of Ethiopia, it's because of the high contribution to international peacekeeping missions. Ethiopia is the first contributor in the world in terms of number of troops in this international mission, and that's the reason of this high position. Here you'll see you have more emerging countries than in the other rankings. So we say also that these emerging countries has low records in economic presence or in soft presence, so they grow because of these military projects. And in the third one, the soft presence ranking, say, for us is a value contribution, no? In that indeed this debate about globalization, and you may see a change here from, in comparison with the other rankings. The first surprising thing for us is that China has reached the second position in soft presence. This is important because of being second, no? We want to be up in the ranking. Okay, one thing I forget to say in the presentation, we try to say that this is not a normative index. This is a positive index. What does it mean? It means that being up in the ranking is not equivalent of doing good or doing bad. For example, we always say that if Spain goes with military troops in Portugal or in France, the president will grow up. But is this good? Is it bad? And here, the reasons of being here are also different. No, I said there are many indicators inside this soft presence. And for example, we have detected that the growth of Asian countries, China, South Korea mostly, is due to technological and scientific indicators. So Asian countries are growing in this soft that we measure that technology in terms of foreign-oriented patents and designs with scientific publications. And we see a high correlation between the growth in soft presence, particularly in science and technology indicators, with the change of the export structure of these Asian countries. Also, you see here more European countries than in the other rankings, and particularly Spain in the 9th position, which we could say that is the main strength of Spanish projection of the world. This is due to tourism, migrations also, and sometimes due to development cooperation funds. And in this sense, we have to say that, for example, other emerging, Turkey or Saudi Arabia, are growing in soft presence due to development cooperation. This, we could go further. Iliana is
the first time South Africa appears in those graphs.
in the top 20.
Yeah.
This is thanks for the observation, because if we want to analyze the South African projection, we'll say that one of its main strengths is also the soft dimension. This is a fact that differs the projection of South Africa between other African countries. So South Africa has economic presence high, but also soft presence high. Other countries, African countries, which is mostly military. So we could go, this is a huge index, 110 countries, and some countries are there because of different reasons, and we could spend 2 weeks talking about the different countries. So Japan, if you're interested, we could go further, but I think we could leave this to the debate, so you pose ask questions.
Just before Leanne starts, I should have said this at the beginning. If you would like to tweet or be on your social media, we do have passwords for the Wi-Fi. Unfortunately, you have to do an individual one for each person. And please follow it directly for Vit's guest. But if you would like to, we used to say, please switch all your phones off, but we're in a globalized world. Please switch your phones on.
Thanks for accommodating me.
I can see.
I love Twitter, so I'm tweeting.
So please use the hashtag global presence. So these will go around. Sorry, I should have said that at the beginning, but over to you now.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Okay, so well, thank you for being here, and thank you, of course, Josiah, Steve, Elizabeth, for having us here today, and especially for helping us understanding our own results on global presence for Africa, because as Manuel said, without the specific knowledge on different regions and different countries, it's really hardly possible to interpret correctly the results of the index. So as Manuel already described the tool, but one thing I could add is that we think that this index, which is a tool, after all, a tool for the analysis of international relations, can be used in 2 different ways. One of them is to understand the external projection of different countries and different regions, just as he explained and described for several countries. And the other thing that we can do with the index is to try to explain global trends in international relations. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit for no more than 10 minutes. Some of the main results that we have found within this objective. So what you have here in this graph is the added global presence of all 100 countries. That is, if we added those numbers of global presence of Spain and South Africa and Japan and China that we have gone through, we would have this final number, which is a little bit below 8,000 in 1990, and see that this added value has been growing for 40 decades now. So in a way, we could say that the added global presence of all 110 countries gives us an idea of the process of globalization itself, whether it is happening or not, if it's a fast globalization or slow globalization, and how it's being reshaped over the years, because we can decompose this process of globalization to each of the 16 variables of the index or into the 3 dimensions, which is what is plotted here in this graph. So the main results, the main trends that we can observe is, well, firstly, that well, there has been a globalization process. This is not a surprise. This is something that we knew following numbers on foreign direct investment and trade. But here we can see that according to each of these 16 variables, and if we add them all up, we would also have a fast globalization process. That process accelerated in the second half of the 90s and until 2012, actually. So there has been a very fast globalization process, and then since 2012, there is some sort of stagnation. Very small increases in some years, very small decreases in other years, but we could say that the maximum was reached in 2012. Another interesting fact is that different dimensions have been driving the globalization process in different moments of this period. So in the very beginning, it was mostly an economic globalization dynamic, because the military presence was very important, but the dynamic dimension was the economic one. And during the 90s and 2000s, there is a retrenchment of the military dimension that responds obviously to the end of the Cold War and the reshaping of international relations to a different indicators. And there is, well, a sort of silent but steady growth of the soft dimension over the 90s and the 2000s. But then there is again a new shift in the last few years. The stagnation periods coincides with a slower growth, or even a retrenchment, a small retrenchment of the economic dimension. It is still the most important one, but it is not the most dynamic one anymore. A change of trend for the military dimension. It is growing again, and this has a lot to do with the acquisition of military equipment by emerging countries that are adhering to the international military system, such as Japan, even Germany, China. And the interesting thing is that for the first time in the last few years, the main driver of globalization is the soft dimension. We would need more time to dig into which specific variables explain which trends, which years. But in a few words, this means that if it was not for the soft dimension, we would be clearly in a trend of deglobalization. So in the economic and military field, in the economic field we are deglobalizing, in the military field, well, it depends, it's more or less stagnating, but the soft dimension is still growing despite the crisis, despite the military conflicts. It is the main trigger of globalization right now. Actually, this might be easier to see in this graph, where you have an independent evolution of each dimension. And there you see how the soft dimension is not the main facet of globalization, but its importance is clearly increasing. One other thing that I would like to point out about the previous graph is that you see all those gray dots, the HHI. It's the Herfindahl-Huijman index, which is a concentration index. We applied this concentration index to the whole database. And what it shows is to what extent all this mass is more or less diversified among a higher or a lower number of countries. So what it says, because if the HHI declines, it means that there is a deconcentration process. So what it says is that during the period of rapid globalization, an increasing number of countries were adhering to the process, so this mass was deconcentrating. And as soon as this globalization process tends to stagnate, the deconcentration process also stops. Of course, this doesn't mean that the main countries explaining this mass are the same at the beginning of the period and at the end. In 1990, China was not among the countries explaining the bulk of the mass of global presence. It is right now. So there is a change of countries, but the number of countries is also changing. Okay, so we could also break down all this mass of globalization by regions. So here, well, we have these 6 regions. We could have 5, we could have 7, but for this report we have used this classification. This is not the standard classification that we use for the index, because we tend to divide North Africa and the Middle East on one hand and Sub-Saharan Africa on the other. But we have an interesting conversation with Elizabeth and Stephen at the beginning of the collaboration, and well, they told us from our perspective it's really difficult to understand the African reality with that classification. It would be important to aggregate North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So we have this small region of the Middle East, and we have added the numbers for all African countries, those that were in alphabetical order in Manuel's presentation.
So Egypt is Africa?
Yes.
Yes.
And not Middle East?
Absolutely.
And not Middle East.
Methodological.
No, but I mean,
for this report,
Well, geographically, it is. Yeah, it's a member of the African Union.
in our website and in our database, there are divided.
And,
Well-
and Russia? The other
if it's the Middle East,
crossover.
no.
Where is
It's
Russia?
In
Europe. No, the thing is that the numbers are calculated by country. So one of the potentialities of the index is that you can do all the classifications you want. I mean, you can add the numbers in different ways. So I mean, it's suitable for different views, geopolitical views of the world.
And you can
let's say.
change the composition of the brain if you
No,
want. also.
but it's important to understand if
Yeah,
we
of course,
measure
of course.
the military potential of Europe,
Of
if you
course.
put Russia
Absolutely.
in or out, it's not the same.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not
Absolutely.
the same.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So if we divide this by regions, well, the first thing is that if you have a look at the y-axis, you will see that the numbers are very different. In the case of Africa, total global presence goes up to less than 450 points, but for Europe it's 5,000 points. So what this means is that this whole thing that we had here, well, 84% of it is happening inside or between 3 regions, which are North America, Europe, and Asia and Pacific. So that Latin America, Middle East, and Africa are very, I don't know, quiet players in the globalization process, let's say. And this concentration has been more or less the same since the beginning of the period. It was in 1990, it is now. What has changed, though, is that there has been a shift from Europe to Asia Pacific. And this is consistent with all these analyses and studies that insist on the fact that the epicenter of world activity is shifting from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So it would be coherent with this, and it would be supported by these numbers. One comment that I should make is that we are not breaking down global presence by destination. What it means is that those numbers for North America, it can correspond to the United States presence in Canada, or it can correspond to United States presence in China. So that's why we are saying that this activity is happening inside the regions or between the regions. This is something that right now we don't know. So as for the 3 big regions, let's say Asia and Pacific and Europe and North America, well, as you see that, and following Manuel's idea that all powers are decaying but are not fallen yet, and that emerging countries are emerging but they have not totally emerged yet, but you can see that Europe has a lot of global presence, but it is losing dynamism since the 2010s. Of course, this corresponds to the crisis partly, but also there is a more structural trend of growing global presence, but this global presence is growing slower and slower compared to that of Asian countries. North America is much more resilient in this sense, and Asia and Pacific is exploding in this sense. As for the other three regions, of course, they have much lower levels of added global presence. It is clear for all three of them, Latin America, Middle East, and Africa. In the case of the Middle East, the impact of commodities prices is very evident. I mean, the global presence increases during prices booms, and it decreases after when the bubble bursts. And in the case of Latin America, a little bit but still, I mean, they have quite a global presence in other indicators and other dimensions. So, I mean, those ups and downs wouldn't be so evident. And here, Africa, I mean, to us, I mean, I'm not at all an expert in the region, but it was quite a surprise because levels are low, but there is a dynamism that is not present in other areas such as Latin America and the Middle East. Also, another thing that is very evident in this graph is the importance of the military dimension for international relations inside Africa or between Africa and other regions. It is a very strong dimension. This, of course, has to do, I will leave that to Elizabeth, but this has a lot to do, for instance, with the participation of several African countries in UN peacekeeping missions, but also a very important and fast-growing soft presence. Okay, so I think I will leave it here, and yes, I will leave it from here.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
One question. Of course, I understand that coming from Elcano, Mexico is in Latin America,
Yeah.
but then we have a very broad network of free trade agreements. So that means that Mexico is a main driver of Latin American bigger numbers.
Absolutely.
Because of course, if the economic dimension is one of the three pillars of this index, then NAFTA will be important too. And we are always, you know, yes, we are North America free trade agreement, but we are Latin America by heart. So that is our great dilemma.
There are several countries, it happens with Russia, with Egypt, with Mexico, that, I mean, according to different classifications, they could be in different regions. In the end, we are picking one classification, we are explaining the reasons we are doing it like that and this. And about NAFTA or the unions or trade agreements, that happens too, for instance, in the European Union. And it's a very interesting point, because something we insist on is that what we try to measure is effective presence, effective results. None of the 16 indicators refers to the efforts or to the tools or to the budgets implemented for global presence or for foreign policy. For instance, the number of diplomats is not part of the index, or whether the country belongs or not to NATO, to the European Union, to NAFTA. Because in the end, all this institutional framework is going to be a driver for achieving different results in terms of global presence. So if NAFTA is a trigger for trade, for Mexican trade, that will be reflected on Mexican numbers in terms of manufacturers and primary goods and energy and services and investments.
Are we in the debate?
Well, we still got.
We still have Elizabeth.
We still have two short things. So if you,
Right,
if
okay,
you would,
perfect.
if you could hold to it, would be great.
Perfect.
So just over to
Yeah.
to look at unpack the African.
So yeah, a little bit. I thought I'd do two things. I would unpack a little bit, or just talk a little about Africa, but also I thought it would be useful to just look at the comparisons with other BRICS countries. I mean, they're all there in the report, but nevertheless, it might be useful just to raise them. So I think the one point to make by way of opening is that Africa has made significant progress since 1990 in absolute terms. Okay, so if you look at that those graphs, 4 graphs, at the bottom the bottom, what color is it?
Orange.
Orange. So the orange is the 1990 value, and the darker color,
Plum.
plum, thank you. I knew it wasn't, that needed to be one of those colors, is the 2017 ranking. And in all of them, Africa's numbers, absolute numbers, have gone up. But the fact is that compared to the rest of the world, Africa has grown at a much slower pace. And Africa here, of course, includes the Maghreb. So, and I think it's important to just bear in mind that this is an index that the African figures reflect the Maghreb as well, and South Africa, because I think those 4 or 5 countries are really the outliers when we unpack the stats. So there's been significant progress, but not as fast as those in other regions, with the one exception, of course, being military. Where, oh, excellent. Okay, so you can
I can do it. I
Yeah,
can do
you
that.
know
I'm
what
good at it.
So Africa is now, as a region, placed 4th in military presence compared to, I think it was right at the bottom, right? Yes, in 1990, and we can unpack a little bit when we look at that. So I think that's an important point. So what Ileana is saying in terms of globalization and as presence also reflecting that driver, I think this is probably something that doesn't come as a surprise to us. I think the point we are very aware of is that Africa, for all its progress and for all of the talk about Africa rising and so on and so forth in the last decade, continues to be the more marginalized of the regions of the world, although there is movement, and I think that's important. I think it's obviously important to note that the regional dimensions are largely determined by the economic dimension in terms of the ranking. So usually, if you're top in the economic dimension, you're also top in the global high in the global presence index. I think it's important to note that in terms of economics, the economic dimension, the gap between the economic presence of Africa and the other regions has actually widened. And that really, again, is a function of what I said earlier, that there has actually been a significant acceleration of other regions, and our acceleration hasn't been as significant and as fast. And part of that, a significant part of that, which is something that occupies the debates we have at the African Union and at the regional economic communities, is that Africa, by and large, again with the exception of the Maghreb, some of the Maghreb countries and South Africa, remains a primary goods exporter, limited exports in the secondary goods category, and so also is subject and victim to the vagaries of the commodity cycle. So I think that's important to note. I think in terms of the military dimension, where Africa has moved up into 4th, I think there are 2 key indicators that I just want to re-emphasize. I think Manuel mentioned them, but it speaks to troops, and that's the number of military personnel deployed in international missions and bases. And then the second one is the military equipment and the importance of naval dimensions. And there are so countries that have a coastline and have navies probably feature higher than others. In the African case, however, that's the exception. That the top 3 countries in the military rankings, no, it's not quite military rankings, but military presence, of course, 2 of them are landlocked. Ethiopia and Uganda are the highest, followed by Egypt. Okay, and Egypt, we know some of the I mean, I think they're all countries. Well, certainly Ethiopia, and Ethiopia, by and large, is the single largest troop contributor to peace missions, and I think Uganda. I'm not quite sure what the Uganda figures are, but these are both landlocked states. Right. If we just move on to the soft dimension, again, there is, I think there is significant progress there. You know, it was 123 points, it's now up to 294, so significant, but not, and sort of, you know, catching up with the Middle, well, maybe not quite catching up with the Middle East. I think there's still sort of 34, 36 points to catch up, but kind of pretty much those two, well, in fact, Latin America, Middle East, and Africa pretty much on a par in terms of soft presence. So I think it's useful to note that. I don't know what the next slide is. I don't know. The map. Okay. So what I want to do now is just unpack a little bit the various countries. So I think maybe it's useful to make the following observation before I do that, is that as Manuel said at the beginning, presence, this index is not about power, in the sense that, you know, I think there are other indices that measure power. There are also other indices. For example, I know that the Lowy Institute does a global diplomacy index, which is about the number of diplomats, the number of embassies, etc., etc. So it's what you put into it, not necessarily what it looks like, the presence. So this is, you said it's about being out there. So it's about visibility. It's about what is interesting clearly, and I think you see that also in the global rankings, is in the African index, power to some extent, at least if you're in the top 5, correlates with presence or visibility. And so the top performers in the index are the countries that we would regard as, you know, in the old days, a decade ago, they used to refer to them as anchor states or regional powers. Some of them might be middle powers, but they're the ones who really are also projecting quite strongly in various fora. So let's just then unpack that. So the top 4 countries, and they are there in the darker colors, the darker plum, is South Africa, that tops it, followed by Egypt with 51.67, South Africa 64.10, Ethiopia with 50.79, and then Nigeria with 37.79. So those are the 4 top countries. They probably largely correlate with regionally the countries that we would see as being regional powers, not only as having a significant global presence. They actually, those 4 countries together make up 53% of the region's aggregate global presence. Am I right? Statistician. And if you throw Kenya and Uganda into that mix, and if you look at those 2 countries, Uganda is sitting at 29.48, I think, and Kenya at 25.5, that really takes it up to over 2/3. So those 6 countries really constitute 2/3 of Africa's global aggregate presence. And, you know, it's probably not, you know, it makes a lot of sense. South Africa, of course, has the region's most significant economic projection, again, understandably. You know, there's been much talk in South Africa about the fact that South Africa is now the 2nd, and maybe sometimes the 3rd biggest economy in Africa, you know, depending on the vagaries of the foreign exchange.
And the price of oil.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nigeria.
But the issue here is clearly that it is by far the most diversified economy. And this presence talks about diversification. It's not, everything is not about size, right? This is about, and South Africa clearly has a much more diversified in terms of its trade, and much more diversified and much more present in terms of its investment. We know in some countries South Africa is among the biggest investors in the continent. So I think that's important. We're also not that, we're not big on military. Huh? We're a soft power. So we don't really feature there, but I'll come back to that. I think what I want to pick up on here is that it's not about being normative. So the fact that you might have a lot of bad press about state capture or about this or about that does not necessarily mean you're low in the rankings. It, in fact, helps you to go up in the rankings, because if we look at soft dimension, and one of them is information, in the case of Nigeria, of course, the Boko Haram, the young girls that were kidnapped, etc., all of that raises the profile of the country. Maybe not a good thing, but it raises the profile, so its presence is much greater.
Why do you think Uganda is higher than Kenya when we often see Kenya as the leader in East Africa?
I need to look at the specific, but I would argue because it's military is much higher, and so that probably, I mean, it's pretty close. It's what? It's less than 4 points difference. So I think the military might be.
Agriculturally, for instance, Uganda in same crops with coffee and others is growing more than Kenya in the last years.
Okay, so it would be interesting to look at the primary commodities and the military and look at their rankings. But I would imagine that would be the case. I probably need to start wrapping up. So I think one of the is there another slide?
Yeah, but it's
okay, it's that one. I think it's useful to just summarize where the various countries stand in the African rankings, and then I'll mention South Africa specifically in terms of the global rankings. So on the economic dimension, South Africa is tops. It's followed by Angola, Nigeria. The two are really hand in hand, very close, and then Egypt. And fifth and sixth are Morocco and Algeria. So those are really the Maghreb countries. So we have 3 out of the 6, in effect, being the Maghreb countries. In military, of course, the topography changes quite significantly. You have Ethiopia, that's really high, sitting at number 1 and I think 11th overall, am I correct? In the overall global rankings on military. I don't have it here now.
Ethiopia, yeah,
it's
19, yes.
No, I think it's higher than that. So Ethiopia is very high militarily, also in the top 20. Now this is the Africa index, so it's earlier. It's followed by Uganda, which I think also makes it into the top 20 militarily. And so Ethiopia is 9th, Uganda is
16th.
Uganda is 16th, and then Egypt I think is 20th. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're really quite high. Followed by Kenya, Morocco, and Algeria. And then in terms of soft presence, South Africa is by far the sort of the outlier at the top, followed by Nigeria. One of the reasons there is also, I think, Nollywood, Boko Haram, and so on. Egypt, which also has a significant, I think, media presence and tourism. And then Kenya, Morocco, and Uganda. I think it would be interesting over the next couple of years to track where Morocco goes, because I think Morocco has also in the last 2 years accelerated, particularly its engagement, since its readmission into the AU, has accelerated its economic and soft dimensions into the rest of the continent. And I think it might be interesting sort of over the next couple of years to see whether we see any change in that. And then Kenya, Morocco, Uganda. Uganda, interestingly, also in terms of soft presence, I thought that was an interesting addition. What I want to highlight and then wrap up is that in terms of the BRICS, of course, South Africa doesn't feature in the top 20 of the global presence overall. It's the only one that doesn't. It does in the soft dimension. So 4 of the 5 are in the top 20 on the Global Presence Index. In economic presence, South Africa is ranked only 30th, while its BRICS partners are in the case of China is number 2, India is 16, Russia is 17, and Brazil is the other outlier that falls outside of the top 20. It sits at 22nd in terms of economic presence. And part of it, I think, has also been the challenges, the economic challenges that it's faced. Militarily, South Africa is ranked only 38th globally, with Russia at number 2, China at number 3, India at number 7, and Brazil still at 18, but I think also looking there at naval naval power, and I think it's also an active troop. It's active in the peacekeeping field, as is indeed India. And then on the soft dimension, that's the only one where South Africa makes it into the top 20. We're sitting at 19th, with China at number 2, Russia at 8, India at 16, and Brazil at 18. But I think one point that is interesting in the case of South Africa is that we're ahead of Switzerland in the top 20 on the soft dimension. And then large, I think it's useful to look at some of the other countries like Ghana, which I think is always regarded as a model sort of country, which isn't, both in terms of its fairly stable democracy, peaceful elections. It's a significant troop contributor, where it's also moved up quite a bit from being 100th in 1990 to 64th in 2017. So maybe I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. And before we get to questions, we invited Simbile,
Do you want to sit here?
Oh, yeah, that would really help.
who has done a lot of work in this area on middle powers, emerging middle powers, lots of definitions which you may want to get into. But we just thought we would get someone who looks at where countries rank and rate to just give a perspective, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve, and thank you to you guys for putting this together and for your really, really insightful presentation. And one of the things that I think is really useful and that I really like about this index is exactly that it doesn't measure power, which can be such a misleading measurement, actually, in many ways, of a country's global impact, but also it's important in the world. And so having the focus be on presence, on this idea of visibility and being out there in as many different ways as it manifests, I think is a really important differentiator of this particular index and this particular measurement. The other thing is to look at the effects of globalization, and I like the way that Manuel or framed his presentation from the beginning, was to look at the effects of globalization over time. And that becomes very striking as you look specifically at Africa in comparison to the rest of the world. So one of the things, if you look at the measurement from 1990 to 2017, is just the extent to which the 1990s was a lost decade for Africa. That the number of civil wars, of unconstitutional changes in government, and the real mess, I think, that was going on in much of the continent in 1990 can really be seen, in the 1990s, can really be seen in the progress of the continent in this index over time. And I think is also one of the things that has allowed South Africa to, South Africa historically has a particular role and had always been able to associate with the West, and so that allowed for the economic development of South Africa historically. But I think that part of South Africa's being able to maintain its position is because it was stable in the 1990s when many other African countries were not. And so that's the first thing that struck me as I looked particularly at the African comparison. The second thing that strikes me, and as Elcano was speaking about why and how Asia has been able to pull forward in front of Europe, particularly in respect of the soft power rankings, is the growing importance of the technological and the scientific in global presence. And it made me, the question I wrote as she was speaking was, will Africa lag? So we see that on soft power in South Africa that is in the top 20 at 19, and one of the reasons it's given in the report is because of the influence of South Africa's education and the influence of it particularly on the continent, but also South Africa's ability to participate in the global market for of technological development and science. I was just, as we were once Stephen told us we could tweet, I saw that 3 of the vice chancellors of the vice chancellor of the WITS, the deputy vice chancellor of WITS, the vice chancellor of UJ, and the vice chancellor of UCT, are all 3 of them taking pictures at the World Rankings Summit that's taking place at the moment in Singapore. And so South Africa has been able to maintain a great deal of its soft power because of innovation and research, and it raises questions about whether the rest of the continent will be able to catch up. I think the idea of leapfrogging is just too far-fetched at the moment. It's just catch up in a way that will enable the development of the continent in general's global presence going forward into the future. The third thing that struck me as I looked at both the report, but also having heard the comments from Manuel and Eliana and Elizabeth, is the interesting inter-African dynamics and which countries are emerging in Africa and which are not. So it's an obvious thing, but that Rwanda doesn't feature particularly in this measurement and in this index, but it's trying very hard to make its presence, but it's tiny, it's very, very small. So one of the really interesting things then is the dynamic between the countries on the continent that at different points try to exert continental leadership or power, but actually are very small in the global context. It'll be interesting to see where Ghana ends up in the next few years, given their efforts at improving their place in the world, both economically and particularly in soft power terms. And then the fourth observation is how reliant still Africa as a whole, if you remove South Africa, is on military presence, for influence. And how much of a role that still plays. On the one hand, I think that it is an obvious function of the intractable conflicts of the continent, right? That so much of our involvement with each other on the continent is military and not economic, right? We're much more involved with each other in terms of whether it's sending peacekeeping troops or being involved in mediation efforts than we are in anything else. But the other thing is that African countries mostly make it into global news because of conflict. So whether that's because of Boko Haram or what was going on in Mali or the ongoing issues in the Great Lakes region. And so that is it's sort of sad to see it reflected in numbers in this way, that conflict and military activity still really define the global presence of the African continent. And so, even though I think that the idea of silencing the guns by 2020 is a bit far-fetched, but this supports the notion that dealing with conflict and security on the continent needs to remain a priority. And linked to that is how vulnerable African countries are to military destabilization and how much that can change the fortunes of a country completely. So what you've seen in Libya, the ongoing issues in Sudan, point to how the contagion effect of conflict and of insecurity can really shift the trajectory on which a country is on, and is something that needs to be thought about by policymakers both within Africa and outside. And then a final question that made me think is, I wonder what the effect of the free trade area will be over time on Africa's economic presence. Because one of the things that strikes me about the economic indicator here is that a huge contributor to it is that African countries trade very little with each other and engage very little economically internally. And South Africa is, you know, far ahead of other countries in the continent in terms of its presence in other countries, both within the continent, and then of course South Africa has historical trade links outside of Africa as well. Now, will the free trade area, if it gets up and running, enable other African countries to engage with each other more? And will that change or affect Africa's position in any way going into the future? And I think, and then I suppose a final observation or comment on the index as a whole. I think that it is really useful for basing a lot of our analysis in reality. So given the shifts, I mean, Donald Trump being laughed at yesterday while at UNGA, the kind of noise that we see coming out of Russia, you know, the hype that came from the BRICS summit a couple of months ago, is that we often speak in ways that make it seem as if we're seeing a very sudden end to world order as it's looked like for 200 years or 450 years, and we're not. That the shifts that are taking place are gradual, and they are uneven, and that the decline of the United States is going to be a very long-term process. But then that raises other questions about, will as different regions of the world, and particularly as Asia Pacific region rises, will we be needing to look at a different set of indicators in, let's say, 20 or 30 or 40 years' time? Will there be other ways other factors that we need to measure in thinking about global presence and importance in the world? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, absolutely. 20 years ago, internet would not have been on your graph. It's interesting what you say about Rwanda. I think it's a very small country that is really trying internationally. I mean, it's, for example, becoming a real destination for meetings and international conferences and so forth. I believe also they've been advertising on football jerseys for Arsenal, I think it is. Visit Rwanda. I actually saw it at the game the other day. So it's a small country that is able to, or certainly trying to project itself internationally. It'd be interesting. I think it was not one of the countries that was measured yet, but maybe it could be one of the next 10, because Elcano is increasing the number of countries it looks at every year. So thank you. That was very interesting responses and questions and comments. We've got about half an hour for comments and questions. Ambassador, do you want